Hello, folks. This is Dragon's Armory. I'm a history buff and a longtime lover of Age of Empires 2. I'm sure many of you have already heard about the upcoming Chinese DLC, and like many of you, after seeing the few screenshots devs have already released, I've also been theorizing which ones the new Civs will be. I kind of wanted to wait until I have more substantial evidence before talking about them, and this week, after the devs have just released their gargantuan new release note for the upcoming patch, now I can say with strong confidence that I know at least two of the civilizations that will definitely feature in the upcoming release: the Jurchens and the Tangut civilizations. I like to take the time to both talk about the special units that's featured and the history of these two civilizations. I will also talk about some of the change notes regarding the Chinese civs, and also theorize which other new faction might be introduced this patch. Before we begin, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Jack. I am the chief editor and artist of Dragon's Armory blog. The blog is mainly focused on Chinese military history and covers Chinese history from the ancient times all the way until 1912. I am also a professional animator and a digital illustrator of over 15 years of experience. I worked on mobile games, board games, movies, concept art, and book covers. So before we go on to theorize about the two civilizations in detail, I think it is appropriate that we talk about what is conclusive from the development patch that we have known so far. Now we have conclusive proof that we're going to get 5 new civilizations. And it is very clear that most of them, if not all of them, will be Chinese-oriented factions, in a move that's very similar to what was done with the Indian faction. And it looks like the Chinese civilization, aside from being an archer-oriented civilization as we had before, will now also lean on it being a gunpowder civilization. And the elite Chokunus will now have essentially rocketry baked into the unit. The recent patch also showed that the cannon galleons will be removed. However, though, there's a caveat that there is now going to be a special ship called the Lotron, which, if you know Chinese military history, Lotron is actually a massive siege ship with trebuchet on top. Camels will also be removed for the Chinese Civ. However, though, at least one of the newly introduced Chinese faction is now going to have a camel-oriented unit. So, just looking at from what the developers give us, there's already a lot that's going on. We see to the screen left, we see green, very likely Chinese faction, is charging at entrenched red faction to the screen right. What is curious is that for the first time, we actually see the Chinese civilization actually has access to step lancers, which is a curious addition. I'm almost certain that the red faction, to the right of the screen, is actually that of the Tanguts. And the reason I say this is because their castle is very specifically coded in a famous ruined city in northwestern China called Karakoto, which means the Black City. It's a very important military fortification and a huge fortress that for centuries served both the Xishan as well as the Mongols after they have conquered all of China. And you can tell because the walls of this castle actually has those distinctive stupa-like towers from it. One of the other reasons I say this faction is that of the Tangut is because I see a very unmistakably Tangut unit to the screen left, which, if you're curious, are those double-humped back-train camels to the screen left with what it looks like a catapult or a trebuchet on its back. Now, this is a very distinctive unit that historically was recorded to have been used and owned by the Tanguts in their operations. Kind of a gimmick unit, but still it was reported. Historically, these camels were mentioned specifically in the history of Song, called the Po Jun, and it was recorded that the Tanguts deployed about 200 of these camels with components of a trebuchet that could be packed to the side of the camel and then reassembled by a dedicated team. Po Jun means the Po army, and this special army essentially served as impromptu horse artillery of the era. During this part of medieval China, trebuchets still referred to traction trebuchet, which meant a team of pullers would pull together and through their combined leverage, throw the projectile far, far away. Now, one of the most fun part about this name that I have not seen covered by any Redditors or any YouTube commentator is the fact that Poxi literally means splashing happiness. As you can imagine, this name was created sort of as a cheeky way of saying these camels are there to dunk on their enemies. On my part, I'm actually very curious how this unit would be translated into the game, because historical sources also mentions that the projectile they fire were only the size of fists. So I would imagine they would be used more as a field artillery that's good against infantry or mobs of units. So I would imagine a more mangonel horse artillery rather than mini trebuchet that's good against buildings. Even with this in mind, it really adds a special touch to the playing style of this civilization, in the sense that for the first time, we're talking about very fast siege equipment that can ride, literally, and follow closely with your main cavalry force. On a personal level, I'll be extremely interested to see if they were designed as anti personnel or anti mob artillery, how having them around would change dealing with mobs of pikemen and massive bulks of halberdiers. A quick little backdrop about the Tangut people is that for centuries they were almost nomadic. And before they were able to get a foothold in Western China and carve out a domain of their own, they served as mercenaries and shock troops for both the Tang Dynasty and also its rival, the Tibetan Empire. The Tanguts were able to serve as fluid mercenaries and shock troops that really played a part in both empires' conquest. And what is interesting about them is that through these opportunistic service, they're able to carve out a niche all for themselves in a way that's similar to the Normans in the Sicilian campaign, how they're able to play off against local powers and then eventually carve out a niche for themselves. And it is because of their origin as mercenary shock troops with a nomadic past. I would not be surprised if this faction is very cavalry focused, which actually corresponds with actual history as well. When the Tangut eventually marched west to carve out a niche for their own, the Tangut army was almost entirely cavalry based. And they were able to excel in battle multiple times by cobbling together multiple armies of cavalry into one massive maul, and use that to overwhelm any other opponent. This way, it guaranteed that no matter who they face, they're able to essentially have a massive death ball of cavalry to just overwhelm the enemy. I will not be surprised if their faction is going to be mostly focused on light cavalry and with a very strong heavy cavalry contingent as well, which is very unique to a Chinese faction. I also think that with units like the Poshi, that it is likely they might have other camel units as well. Now, it is said that the OG Chinese civilization will no longer have camels, but I have a hunch that perhaps the Tanguts will be one of those factions that is able to still lean on the camels as part of their overall strategy. This sort of leads me to the second unique unit that I see in the screenshot. Now, we're still on the first screenshot of the one beside the Tangut castle. But to the screen left, and also owned by the Green faction, there is a special unit that really drew my attention. It is a very unique looking heavy cavalry unit, perhaps a cataphract that is encased in full armor and wields a massive two-handed looking polearm. There's numerous amount of this unit to the left side of the screen, and they also carry a very distinctive shield on their back as well. This unit actually caused some no insignificant amount of debate on the Chinese forums and amongst Chinese netizens who are huge fans of the game. The main contention comes to the what exactly this unit is. And there is two strong camps that argues about it. The first theory argued that these units are a famous Tangut cataphract unit called the 铁鹞子, which meant the Iron Sparrows, or the Iron Sparrowhawks, and who were an elite division of Tangut cataphracts. And this camp argues that because they're from the same factional color as the camel trebuchet, that's why they say these are a Tangut unit. But I actually slightly disagree. I actually leans to the other hypothesis that these cataphracts are actually the unique unit of another faction, the Jurchens, and they would be the famous Iron Pagoda cataphracts. The reason I'm confident to take a stab at this is because I am almost completely sure that the Jurchens are going to be featured as one of the newly introduced civilizations. Now, in the screenshot, the other screenshot that we have, the snowy landscape with the other distinctively Chinese fortress to the left side of the screen that is being besieged. If you look at the flags that is on the fortress, you're going to see a very distinctive black pennant with the white sun. And it is a very distinctive flag that were once specifically used by the Jurchens. And these were depicted in that features a distinctive Jurchen iron pagodas carrying them during their march. Another factor that lends credence to my argument is that if you look at the back shield strapped onto these cataphracts, you're going to see a distinctive disc shape that is placed over four quadrants. Now, this is also part of the flags used by the Jurchens, especially in depictions of the iron pagodas when they ride into battle. Lastly, the easy part, the distinctive, almost unmistakable silhouette. Iron pagodas are very special in that it has a very iconic look, where the warrior, both man and horse, are both completely encased in lamellar armor, and for the rider only has his eyes and hands exposed. Historically, they were an elite part of the Jurchen war machine when they fought their wars against their overlords, the Kitan, and later in their invasion of Song Dynasty China and the overrunning of much of the Central Plains through the use and massive deployment of these heavy cataphracts. On the mostly flat plains of central China, they proved a devastating force, especially if thousands of them cluster together and ride very closely. What's more is they were specifically designed to maximize their charge. Unlike many steppe cavalry armies of the period, or many of the conquest dynasties, the Jurchen actually deployed their cavalry more akin to armored fists. And for the Iron Pagoda cavalry, unlike their former overlords, the Khitans, and other empires, instead of using light cavalry in front of the heavy cavalry as a screen and as a scouting force, the Jurchen instead put their heavy cavalry on the vanguards and then in order to use them as an unstoppable armored fist. And then they cobbled together the light cavalry behind that armored fist in order to further assist in their penetration. More fanciful records about these units even claim that in order to further maximize their charge, that the heavy cataphracts actually link leather ropes between each other, so when they ride down the enemy as a massive tide of iron, that it would just take down any infantry along their way. Although this has been somewhat disputed by later historians. However, though, I'm curious if the devs might actually implement this somehow into perhaps a great level of trample damage that the unit is able to inflict. As was the case with the Poshi army, I'm curious how the Iron Pagoda cataphracts are going to be implemented in this game. I have a suspicion that they might be able to deal area of effects damages, or have trample damages that's carried over. If that's the case, then it will be interesting to see a Chinese faction that is this specialized in heavy cavalry, as opposed to the OG Chinese civilization, which is more of a jack of all trade, fast development civilization. With that said, let's shift our focus to the final unique unit that we see on the bottom right of the second screenshot. It is there that we see a special, very distinctive unit that carries around over-exaggerated spiked flail in its hand. Now, what is curious is that if we look closely at the environment around them, there is actually a lingering burning fire around him, which led many netizens to suggest that what they carry might actually not be a simple melee weapon, some flail, and in fact they were carrying bombs, or that they were in fact bomb slingers, which, if you actually study the history of the Jin Dynasty and the history of the Jurchens, they later on actually become excellent bomb makers and grenadiers. Historically, early on during the Jurchen's conquest, they were actually not familiar with the explosive weapons, and it was only when they tried to assault the Song Dynasty imperial capital at Kaifeng that they met their first encounter with explosive bombs, which reportedly caused a lively terror among their ranks. Despite this initial being caught flat footed by their enemy, they quickly adopted this weapon, and the next time they showed up at Kaifeng again, this time the Jin had their own arsenal of bombs and weapons at their disposal, and they were quite good at it. After about a century of ruling central China, by that time the Jin dynasty became masters of bomb making and had their own arsenal, deadly bombs which were encased in iron and explode out shrapnel. I don't know how this unit will be implemented, but I'll just say that I'm very cautiously optimistic and wait to be impressed by the firework, I guess. Lastly, before I sign off, I like to guess around which other factions we might get in this patch. So, aside from the Tanguts and Jurchens, I actually think the third contender, and the strongest one possible, is actually that of the Kitan Liao dynasty. The reason I say this is probably because before the Tanguts even came along and before the Jurchens came along and built their own empires, the Liao was the template for a successful Sinicized steppe-led dynasty in northern China. And they played a vital role of a kingmaker in northern China after the Tang dynasty fell and intervened and politicked aggressively. For a time, they were the main arch nemesis of the Song dynasty. And of themselves, they built a thriving and military formidable state, and was actually well liked by their Han subjects. However, though, they were eventually displaced by their Jurchen vassals and kicked to the west. The key is that their story did not end there. If anything, the Chitans, after they were kicked to the curb to the west, actually become even more interesting. Because in the west, in what is today's Xinjiang province and the Fergana Valley area, they built a remnant successor state called the Western Liao. And in other words, it was called the Karakitai. Trouble did not end for this Karakitai state because trouble soon came from the west, of all places. In their acquisition of Fergana, the Karakitai state has actually grinded against the vassals of another much larger empire that was ruling most of Central Asia and even touching Europe at the time, and that is the Great Seljuk Empire of the Turks. This eventually led to a massive confrontation where the Seljuks marched east in order to confront the upstarts, and behind them came the whole host of emirs from the Middle East and from the Levantine states. There, though broken, this ruined second Liao rump state still inflicted a crushing defeat in the Battle of Katwan against the Seljuk hosts. The defeat was so lopsided that it caused the Seljuk to collapse. The Seljuk Empire began to fragment, and the ripple effects could be felt even amongst the Western Crusaders, to which the legend of Prester John was born. It is also interesting to note that the dev notes listed several instances where Karakitai is featured in the campaigns, and now says their factions have been changed. I lean on this as confirmation that we finally are able to get a Karakitai faction, or a Karakitai/Liao faction. My guess is that this faction will somewhat be a chameleon in the campaigns. For some of the parts where it's set in an older time frame, they might be called the Liao. But the later eras where it's depicted in the West, it might be called the Karakitai. Either way, I think it will be a very unique faction if they're truly featured. I think it would be a Chinese faction that also blends with a lot of Central Asian factions elements. So the same steppe lancers that we saw before with the Tanguts, and perhaps they also get to have access to camels and the like. As for the last two factions, I actually have much less to go on by comparison. The reason I say this is because of the visual elements that we get and of the process of elimination that we get. There's still not much for me to go conclusively on to say that they might be one or the other. I am also somewhat not sure when the devs said 5 brand new factions, that a reworked OG Chinese faction is considered brand new faction after work has been done to it. Like, what are we talking about here? A Chinese faction that actually gets all the historical inventions that China invented and not have those be the one that's gated out? Kidding aside, actually including some of those inventions into and the OG Chinese civilization would give it a different feel to it. Though I would say that purely in speaking of a civilization's design perspective, I actually kind of always liked the OG Chinese civilization, which I guess now come to be represent more of a Song dynasty and the Ming dynasty. I always like the faction because it's very versatile. It's a jack of all trade, and in the hands of a high elo player, they really can make miracles happen. It is just so satisfying with the civilization that is so generous with options available to you that give you great discounts for technological advancements as well as options to kitbash all sort of responses with your trash army against any kind of threat that emerges. I have also heard some theorizing that the fourth civilization might actually be that of the Tibetans. I am somewhat reserved about that judgment as of yet, mainly because from the promotional materials I have seen so far, I didn't notice any distinctive Himalayan style architectural set for the factions. I think that's going to be a big tell for if they're going to be introduced. Speaking of tells, there is some evidence that the fifth civilization might actually be that of the Dali kingdom in Yunnan. And this is stemmed from a third screenshot that they released, which shows a very lush palace setting. Dali is kind of a niche topic even amongst that of Chinese history, but for those who are unfamiliar with the kingdom's history, during this period of division, in the highly mountainous region of what is today's Yunnan province, there's actually an independent kingdom ruled by the ethnic minority Bai people, at the head of a coalition of many other minorities of the region. Because the province is so surrounded by many strategic mountain passes that are extremely difficult to traverse through and penetrate, the interior of that valley and the lake forms the kind of a lush sanctuary all to itself. For many centuries, Dali actually played the role of a key facilitator between the Song dynasty and that of the many Tibetan peoples in facilitating the critical trade of tea into the Tibetan lands from the Song interior and that of horses, especially purebred war horses from the Tibetan plateau into Song China for its state security. It would be very interesting to see Dali represented. Well, folks, that's the detailed dive of my analysis of the civilizations. I will definitely do another follow up immediately after the official announcement began, mostly to see if there's any coincidental overlaps between my interpretations and the design philosophy the devs had so far. By that point, we would have much more information on each of the civilizations that's going to be released, and we can go through them one by one in detail together. So definitely stay tuned and stay interested. I'm certainly still going to be here, and I'd be very interested to release more of these kind of videos in the coming future. Just on the topic of Chinese military history and Chinese armor design, I am also going to cover Warhammer's new release of Grand Cathay in a coming video. And aside from Warhammer, there's also going to be a bit of exploration of Age of Mythology's new release of the Chinese civilization and the Chinese units, just to see how accurate they represent the historical Chinese arms and armor and whether it's well implemented. Now, shout out to my friend Chili Empire, who actually shares a lot of my interest in this area, and just for being an all-around good guy who encourages me to make such videos. So there's thank you for that. Thank you to my friend Buren, who always encourages me to put my Dragon's Armory material into video files so people can appreciate what I've written all those years in the lonesome dark. Thank you as well, my friend. This couldn't have been done without your encouragements. And to you, fresh listener, if you just discovered me from this video alone, know that I have been writing about Chinese military history for quite a long time, at least 15 years now. So if you're interested to talk about Chinese military history, feel free to come to my Discord. It's a very friendly and free-form space where we can talk about all sorts of stuff from history all the way to perhaps fantasy army building. if you're interested in building an East Asian coded faction or a Chinese inspired faction and army, I'll be happy to go over those with you as well, just for fun. Kind of bring this back full circle again. Because of my experience in game design and character design and concept art, I'll be happy to go over details if you have a character created that is Chinese inspired or East Asian coded and give you historical based pointers in those areas as well. For the time being, if you're interested in sprucing up basic information about this age, I'm happy to tell you that I actually wrote extensively of this period of high medieval China, of the Song dynasty, of the Jurchen Jin dynasty, of the Tangut Shisha dynasty, and the Dali kingdom. And I wrote of all of them in extensive detail on my blog on Dragon's Armory. What's more, beyond just this age of medieval Chinese history, I also covered a variety of topics, including from the very beginning of Chinese literary history, from the Mandates of Heaven's War between the Shang dynasty and the Zhou dynasty, all the way to the Spring and Autumn's era and the ensuing Warring States era. Each article usually comes with hundreds of illustrations and references images that really spruce up the feeling of that age. If you're interested in what I'm doing and also likes what I do on my blog, definitely feel free to support me on Patreon. And with all of that said, all I can say is stay excited. Stay excited until the new patch release, and I'll be right here waiting with you.